We're continuing with the Shawl Collar Vest Knit-along and adding Afterthought ribbing at the bottom. So those of you who began in ribbing can skip this movie. Today we're working on a vest that will finish to either 40 or 42 inches in the chest at a gauge of 3.5 stitches per inch. The written pattern, which is in vests with men in mind, has 9 sizes and 2 gauges so that anybody with a bulky machine should be able to knit it. If you began with waste yarn or a cast-on rag, again you can see my cast-on rag is hung with weights in it, and I'm knitting across one row of contrasting yarn from left to right, which is probably what you did, although your single row may have been a ravel cord. I used contrasting yarn to make it really visible to you. Then you went on and you knitted the vest front and back from the point that will eventually be above the ribbing all the way up through the armhole shaping and in the front the neckline shaping. Now it's time to hang the front and the back one at a time and knit the ribbing as an afterthought. The purl side of the fabric should be in view as you hang. Pick up the first row of main yarn stitches and hang them on the needles. Because of the way knit stitches are formed, top and bottom, you will have one fewer stitch than you actually cast on and worked with. That will give us an odd number of stitches. If you have an even number, due to some small miscalculation, don't worry about it now. Just hang everything. Then after knitting the first row, decrease 1 stitch because we do prefer an odd number of stitches for our ribbing. The contrasting row of yarn makes it very easy to see the strands of yarn that constitute the first main yarn row. When the ribbing is complete, that contrasting yarn or ravel cord will be pulled out. In the case of contrasting yarn, sometimes you have to snip it in a few places, but it'll slide out if you do. If knitting the just below the waist length vest, you probably want the ribbing to pull in quite a bit. So you'll want to go 2, maybe even 3 numbers smaller than the main knitting on the dial. If knitting the tunic length, you probably don't want the ribbing to pull in, so you'll want to use main stitch size or close. If hand manipulating the ribbing, add enough weight to allow you to knit. This is a bar weight, but it could be a series of claw weights. Knit 16 rows, ladder down, latch up every other stitch as a purl stitch, and bind off using some method that produces chain stitch. If you have gate pegs, binding off around the gate pegs is ideal. Otherwise, the transfer bind off works well, or pretending you have gate pegs by treating the next needle over as a gate peg. If using a ribber, after getting the first main yarn row hung, place the carriage on the left, knit 1 row to the right. Then transfer every other stitch from that first row to the ribber. Using a ribber, you will definitely need some weight on the fabric. You can hang your ribber comb in the waste yarn. Just as with hand manipulated ribbing, you'll need to choose a stitch size, probably 2 to 3 whole numbers smaller than the main knitting. If you're knitting the shorter version, possibly the same exact size or slightly smaller if you're knitting the tunic version. Knit your 16 ribbing rows, then transfer all the ribber stitches back to the main bed and bind off around the gate pegs. Here's how it will look when your garment comes off of the machine. This is my cast-on rag. The pink is my one contrasting strand of yarn, and it's sticking out on the main side, the public side of the knitting. I don't care what happens to my contrasting strand, so I'm pulling it out in bits as it happens to work best. You could also reach in with a tiny pointy pair of scissors and snip it in a few places. You just do not want to snip your main fabric, of course. My cast-on rag is fine. It may be used again anytime I need it, and the ribbing looks beautiful. All ribbing should get a lengthwise pull to set the stitches to look its very best.